What's next for Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker in the effort to bring jobs to Wisconsin and health care reform? I'll ask him. He's right next to me. I'm Charlie Sykes, and Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was, wildfires in Colorado and a heat wave in Wisconsin. Summerfest celebrates its 45th anniversary. The Attorney General is held in contempt of Congress. A labor boycott targets a local business, Palermo's. But all eyes were focused on the U.S. Supreme Court, which issued a series of bombshell decisions. First, the court struck down some parts of Arizona's controversial immigration law, but upheld others. And on Thursday, the big one. By a vote of 5-4, the High Court upheld Obamacare, including the individual mandate, as long as that mandate was not considered a mandate, but was a tax. You know, a tax. Like President Obama absolutely positively said it wasn't.
If I say that right now your premiums are going to be going up by 5 or 8 or 10% next year, and you say, well, that's not a tax increase. But on the other hand, if I say that I don't want to have to pay for you not carrying coverage even after I give you tax credits that make it affordable, then...
I don't think I'm making it up. Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Tax, a charge usually of money imposed by authority on persons or property for public purposes.
George, the fact that you looked up Merriam's dictionary, that the definition of tax increase indicates to me that you're stretching a little bit.
Well, no. We have a special guest on this morning's show. Instead of our regular panel, we're joined by Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who has been in the news a little bit lately. Well, let's talk about the Supreme Court decision with Obamacare. The first question, of course, is what happens here in Wisconsin? You said afterwards that you continue to be opposed to Obamacare and that you're not going to move ahead with implementing it. So what will happen and what are you going to do?
Well, we're not, and there's a simple reason for that. It now, just philosophically, it's a horrible decision for the vast majority of people in the state. We used the actuarial firm that was in place before I became governor to do an analysis this past year and found under the Affordable Care Act, the president's Obamacare, essentially, the majority of people in this state will pay more money, more money for less service than they had before. This is a horrible precedent, and it has a damaging impact on the economy. So from our standpoint, I said months ago, legal is the first step, political is the second step. Third step we'll figure out after that. So we're not going to do anything till after the November 6th election.
Okay, now there was some controversy about this the day after that, whether or not you are going to be following the law. This is the law. The Attorney General was quoted. Of course, the governor has to follow the law.
Well, but people who look at the mechanics of the law is in effect because of the Supreme Court. Yeah. But in Wisconsin's case, the first major step we would have to make comes after the election. It comes in January of 2013. And then and only then do we have to show whether we're ready to do an exchange if the law was still being upheld. Yeah. And that wouldn't take effect till January of 2014. Okay. So there's a long ways out to make decisions on this. We shouldn't be spending taxpayers' time and money on something that very well could be thrown out come January of next year.
Okay, so you're not talking about whether to comply with the law or not to comply with the law. The question is just simply the timing and when you begin implementing the
right, from our standpoint, we could come next January and say we're going to do a very short, simple exchange if there wasn't a new president, if there wasn't a new United States Senate and a Congress that we're going to overturn this. We'd come back and say, okay, we have one of two options. Either Wisconsin can do a very limited exchange, or conversely, we could opt to say, no, we're going to let the federal government run the exchange and let them take on the financial burden that otherwise would be that of the states. But we don't have to do that until after the November election. So why, when it very likely could be that if Governor Romney got in, we had a new U.S. Senator from Wisconsin that was part of a Republican majority, that you couldn't very well have an overturn of that law.
Okay. Now, in terms of the Supreme Court decision, we could talk about why Justice Roberts did what he did. Let's leave that aside. Let's talk about the politics of it. The last time that there was a survey that I saw in Wisconsin that was the Marquette University law poll, which nailed your recall election, found that only 33% of voters supported Obamacare. So politically, in the last week, this is a big victory for President Obama. They're obviously popping the champagne corks. How does this play now, between now and November, in the presidential election and the Senate election in Wisconsin?
I think it's a huge issue. And if you think about it, it may be a victory for the president within the Beltline. But I think you look beyond Washington, D.C., it becomes crystal clear. If you're Mitt Romney running for president of the United States and you want to make the case you're ready to take on the fiscal and economic crisis, you say on day one, which he said, he's going to take action to repeal Obamacare. If people don't like Obamacare, it's now clear the only way to change that is to get rid of President Obama. And on top of that, even with a new president, you can't do that unless there's a new Republican senator in places like Wisconsin and a handful of other key swing states around the country. I think it's very clear for Republican candidates running not only for the presidency but for the U.S. Senate seats.
Is it difficult, though, for Mitt Romney to make that case, considering that in Massachusetts he presided over something that became the model of it?
I don't think so, because, again, this is saying I don't think the federal government should be involved in this. States can do, 50 states can do 50 different things if they want to. In Wisconsin's case, we certainly wouldn't do what the federal government's mandating, because we wouldn't do something that would hurt the majority of people in our state and make them pay more money for less coverage. We do something that would be more market-driven. We're one of the unique states where over 90% today of our people are covered with some sort of health coverage out there. Only about 6 or 7% don't have it. And the idea that the federal government's going to mandate a complete change in the healthcare system to address that, when we could do it better in the state, people like Governor Romney, I think, make a very compelling case. Let the states decide on their own. Don't let the federal government mandate that and mess it up.
Now, later in the program, I want to talk more about jobs, which of course, were a big issue in the recall campaign, a big issue in your first campaign. One of the consequences, of course, of the Supreme Court's refusal or the failure to strike down Obamacare is that uncertainty remains in place over the private sector. And a lot of employers have been saying that they have been waiting on investments, waiting on expansion and employment, not knowing what's going to happen and what the cost of employment will be under Obamacare. So does this hurt job creation nationally and in Wisconsin?
Yes, and the closer we get to November, the more likely it is that there'll be a new president, a new majority in the Senate, the better off we'll be for job creators. We saw that in our recall. We heard that from employers who said, we like what you're doing, we like the direction you're heading, but we're holding off and we're waiting until June 5th to after the recall election. And I think a lot of employers, particularly small businesses, were waiting in the same way in hopes that somehow the Supreme Court would throw this out and they have some certainty of knowing it won't continue. Now that uncertainty continues through November. Now, I hope as the campaign progresses and it hopefully becomes clearer and clearer that Governor Romney's got a real shot, that we have a real shot at getting the U.S. Senate, that people will take that risk even before the November elections to put people to work, but I can understand why.
Now, this will go back to something we were talking about before, because there's nothing under the law that requires you to take any action to implement Obamacare now. In fact, you don't have to do it until, way past the election. But one of the decisions you're going to have to make, and it will be your decision, will be whether or not the state of Wisconsin then will set up these exchanges under Obamacare. If you don't do that, the federal government comes in, my understanding is, and then they set it up for you. I'm guessing that a lot of the local insurance companies are telling you, we'd rather you regulate us than the federal government. But is there a possibility you would just turn that over to the federal government?
Well, it's one of the options. Governors have talked about it before. In a few weeks, I'm going to be at the National Governors Association. I presume at this point, there's even some Democrats we've heard from who've had concerns because, like so many other federal programs, remember years ago when President Clinton talked about 100,000 cops in the street? What they didn't tell the rest of the story was a few years later, the money got pulled, and the local governments got stuck with the bill for money they didn't have to begin with. I think a lot of us at the state level, governors, certainly Republicans, but even some discerning Democrats say, hey, wait a minute. If you up the ante here, you start manning more things, you have more requirement for people to be involved in Medicaid, and then you pull the funding away, what's going to happen to us in the future? Where do we get that money from? And that may be one of the options of why you'd say, no, let the federal government do it, and then they're responsible for paying for it.
Okay, now more with Governor Walker in just a moment, including what are his plans for 2016? We'll be right back. More with Governor Scott Walker. Now let's, Politico had a big story about you this last week. Scott Walker wants national roll. Scott Walker has more political capital than any Republican in America after surviving this month's recall election. Now he intends to spend it. And very specifically, it says you do not rule out running for president in 2016. So what is with that?
Yeah, I laugh with interviews like that. He said, what are your plans for running for re-election for governor? What are your plans running for president in 2016? And I said, I don't have any plans for the future. It seems pretty simple answer, right? But suddenly they say, oh, hi, you didn't say you weren't running. For me, the national role I want to have is, I think, for whatever political capital I have, first and foremost, I'm going to use it to reach out to employers, both those here and across the country, to create more jobs, because that's job number one. Secondly, I'm going to help like-minded candidates, be it Governor Romney, be it people like Reed Ribble or Sean Duffy staying in the House, and hopefully whomever the Republican nominee is for Senate in the state, and others around the country. And third, whether it's on health care, talking about this huge tax increase in Obamacare and trying to fight that, or talking about pension reform or budget reform or other issues like that, if I can use that to make the state and my country better for my kids, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, now it also goes on to say that your challenge now is to capitalize on the stardom while convincing whiplash Wisconsinites that you want to bring the noise level down enough at home to get stuff done. Fair enough?
Yeah, well, that's why priority number one, jobs. I mean, the great thing about all the attention I got is there's not an employer across the country, in fact, some around the world, that won't take my call. I called an employer doing some work in China the day after the election about making some foreign investment in the country, here in Wisconsin. And I thought I'd explain what was going on. He said, "No, I watched your speech."
Well, who you were.
It was very weird, a little surreal for me. But for whatever value there's out of that, I'm going to apply that to saying, let's promote Wisconsin, not promote Scott Walker. Let's do it. It's why the night of the election, you didn't see my name. Normally in a political campaign, victory night, the name's plastered. You saw my name nowhere. It just said moving Wisconsin forward, because we're going to use that capital to do just that.
Well, this last week you were down in Illinois, and the headline, I think, was something like that, "I'm not here to poach business from you." Well, why not? I mean. Well,
we went to that.
Wasn't that the whole Wisconsin's open for business thing?
It is, but good example. We're at the Commercial Club down in Chicago, making the case a lot of CEOs of companies that do business globally. And I said, it's not about taking the business out of Chicago, because frankly, we want to, in the Midwest, we do well if Chicago's doing well, if Illinois in part is doing well. It's value to us on an economic basis, from a global basis, I should say. But for companies that do business around the world, we want to make a very compelling argument, whether it's speaking there, whether it's speaking in New York or anywhere else around the country, that this is a state you should do business in.
Okay, well, let's talk about the politics a little bit, because, of course, obviously, it was political ground zero with your recall election. By the way, have you taken a vacation yet since the recall election?
The best I did was the Sunday after the election. I literally went out in my Harley all day.
Yeah,
that's pretty.
But then you were back at work on Monday.
I was. Heck, I was back at work 5:30 the morning after. I don't want to get lit up. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done here.
How are you approaching this, though? It's sort of like, Walker term 1.5 now, the second half of your first term. Are you treating this as it's going to be different? Is this kind of like a quasi-second term for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an opportunity to make some changes, to make some improvements, to tune things up a little bit, but our focus is going to be the same. It's economic fiscal crisis we inherited. We made it better, but we're not done yet. And so for me, the more I can do to bring more employers in the state, to take, more importantly, those small businesses that are here and make them. I had a great example. I called somebody today earlier in the Capitol where I'm talking with someone, and they were thrilled. They actually said, it was great working with your DNR. The tax code's much better than the state we came from. They were thrilled about being here. Well, I want to have those sorts of experiences with every employer in the state of Wisconsin, where we're calling to check in, and they're telling us they like the way we do business. They like the seamless effort between the state and the local, the county government and the local community. Those are the sorts of things we need to build on. And we're not done yet. We still got a lot of work to do.
Okay, but is there any way that next year is going to be able to top last year?
Not in terms of attention. My hope is yes, not in terms of some big issue, some big reform that gets even more attention, but yes, in the sense that next year, I think people will look back, and now that things have settled a little bit, they'll look back and see all the benefit of the things that we've done, and see that next year will top, or this coming year will top this past year in terms of jobs. Okay,
now when we come back, I want to ask you about that. I want to talk about some of the job numbers that came out just this last week that were a big issue during the campaign, and also what the political environment is like now, because since last time we spoke, it looks like the Democrats are going to take control of the state Senate. More with Governor Scott Walker in just a moment. Welcome back to our conversation with Governor Scott Walker. Now, in the last week, the jobs data that you had released early during the campaign were made official, and Wisconsin did gain just under 20,000 jobs last year, according to the federal government. And of course, they were heavily debated. Obviously, that was better than the initial reports that we had lost jobs, but it turns out that we do lag the rest of the country, that in fact Wisconsin was 41st in overall job creation. Your reaction to those numbers and what needs to happen in 2012?
Yeah, for us, we put it in perspective. Obviously, the 3 years before I was in office, we lost 100,000. Unemployment was over 9%. We've now gained jobs. We're gaining even more jobs in 2012. Unemployment's down below 7% for the first time since 2008. All good indicators. We got to do more. I think part of it is no great surprise. I said this in the campaign. I'd say this since. Part of that was because a lot of people saw the recalls. They were concerned about it, particularly this year, going into June, where a lot of people were, from spring on, said, hey, and we like where this is headed.
Yeah.
I mean, remember the indicator 2 years ago in 2010, the survey done of employers said 10%, just 10%, thought we were heading in the right direction. 94% now believe that we're heading in the right direction. We need to build off of that, and I think, per your question earlier about, is it get bigger next year, I think the big news, hopefully, is the reforms worked, not just to balance the budget, they worked to inspire that kind of confidence from employers.
But a lot of people were hoping, and I'm sure business was hoping, that the chaos would be over on June 5th. I know you were hoping that it was going to be over on June 5th, but it looks like the Democrats succeeded in knocking off Republican Senator Van Wangard, which means that they will have, at least until January, control of the Wisconsin State Senate. So aren't we now in a situation where between now and the end of the year, state government has complete paralysis, and doesn't that complicate the issue?
No, and here's why. Because between now and January, there is no legislative session.
Right.
The only way you could come in is through an extraordinary session, which would take both the Assembly and the Senate, which is not likely to happen, or a special session, to which I've said I'm only calling one if I can get agreement on some issues from all 4 caucuses, Assembly and Senate, Democrat and Republican. If we can get that, we do that. If not, we'll wait until later after the fall and into the January session mark. And I think so for anybody who's concerned about uncertainty, I think you look ahead going to 2013 and on, the seat in northern Wisconsin where Jim Holpern, the state senator there, is announced he's not running again, very likely to be won by Tom Tiffany, a state representative up there. And there are 2 or 3 other seats where actually I did very well in, where you're going to have competitive state senate elections. Ironically, you might actually see not only Republicans regain the majority, but regain by a larger margin than they had before the recalls.
What happens if the Democrats want to come in and vote on mining legislation? I mean, is there any chance for mining? You had held the hope open for some mining legislation. What if the Democrats say, okay, you know what, we would like to come back in and we're going to pass our version of mining legislation? Is the door open to that?
Well, what I've said all throughout this process is I don't want to pass them just for the headline. I don't want to say, oh, we passed a mining bill if it doesn't create any jobs. To us, the only reason why it was worthwhile to streamline the process for safe and environmentally sound mining was so that you'd have the 2,300 proposed mining jobs that would be either directly or indirectly related to that. For us to just come back and pass something just to claim that we passed something, I'd rather spend the time working throughout this summer into next year, get a bill that can actually get the jobs, at the same time can get enough support, ideally support from across political lines, but one that actually produces jobs.
Okay, so that would be in 2013. Now, the mining company did pull out of Wisconsin and say they were done after that failure last year. Do you have any indication that they would be willing to come back in, that if in fact you did have the votes, the Republicans did have the majority, that this could still be a done deal, that we could still have those mining jobs?
Oh, I think there's no doubt. As much as they were frustrated with what they saw were really petty politics, I think they felt, as did some of the labor leaders, that this really was a vote not about the substance, but ultimately about pushing back on me and trying to prevent me from having a victory when it came to jobs before the recall election itself. I think looking forward, if they thought we could pass this, if there was something reasonable that would make it possible for them or other companies like them to come in. But again, the key caveat is it's not just passing a bill that you call mining. It's got to be one that actually makes it easy for a mining company to come in, abide by all the clean air, clean land, clean water standards, but a streamlined process for safe and environmentally sound mining. If you do that, it actually relates to jobs, then it's worth coming in, and whether it's now, whether it's after November, whether it's after January.
More likely after January, though.
Yeah, I think so, to do it right.
More with Governor Walker in just a moment, but first, here's your morning news update. We're back with Governor Scott Walker. You know, we were talking about the disappointment of the mining bill. The other piece of legislation that seems to be in abeyance is the photo ID bill. I talked with Attorney General J.B. Van Hollen on Friday on my radio show, and he said that he is not optimistic that the state Supreme Court is going to take that up before the November election. Your reaction to that?
Well, I think that's incredibly frustrating. I think a lot of us were even frustrated it wasn't in place before June 5th's election, particularly when you think about this. February, when the law was in effect after we'd signed it and become a part of the law, I think almost every media outlet out there talked almost surprisingly so about the fact that there really weren't problems with it. So there's not some clear problem with administering the law. It's an issue where it got brought up on an injunction in front of a circuit court in Dane County. But it seems reasonable that for one of the most important elections in our lifetime, that the law should be fully in effect. And I also find it amazing to me, for all the talk out there, this used to be like an 80-20 issue. I mean, you talk to Democrats, Republicans alike outside of elected office, and most people just say, duh, this is a no-brainer.
So how long is it going to take, and this may be a longer answer than we have time for, but how long is it going to take for things to get back to normal in Wisconsin, for us to heal from what happened here in Wisconsin in 2011? Actually,
I think it's surprising it will happen quicker than you think. It'll take a little bit longer in Madison than the Capitol. Although our beer summit, the Brat Summit and everything else we did with that helped, because a lot of people missed that socializing, because a lot of what we do isn't particularly one part or the other. It's a lot of technical things out there. People enjoy the opportunity to battle hard, but then to go out and have a meal or a beer with people out there. But I think for a lot of folks, I mean, think about it. Go around the state, almost all those bumper stickers for and against me are gone, because people were ready to move on. I think the average citizens got back to life. They got to Summerfest. They got up to county fairs. They're having a good time. A little bit of a spur up in the fall with the fall elections. Well, but I think most people, clearly, the citizens of our state have moved on. The politicians just need to catch up with the rest of us.
How much of your vote was a backlash against the recall, a backlash against what had happened in Madison?
I think a little bit of that, although I was surprised at the end to find out how many people identified themselves as Democrats or people voted for my opponent and told me that they were voting for me not because they didn't like the recall, which may have been part of it, but because they liked the fact that we had the courage to take on tough issues. That's the thing I think people crave more than anything, is in times of crisis, they don't want just Democrat or Republican leadership, they want leadership. And to the extent that that happens not only here in Wisconsin, but that we have leaders in Washington that want to do the same, I think people gravitate to it.
Well, listen, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it very much. And thank you for listening to Sunday Insight. And remember, my radio show on News Radio 620 WTMJ, Monday morning at 8:30.